Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad that you could all join us on this quintessential November Oregon day. As crazy as this year has been in so many ways and unpredictable, uh, it's nice to look out the window and see that Mother Nature is right on time with November weather, and it provides a sense of, I guess, reassurance that we live in such a beautiful part of the world, even in a very difficult year. And it's a great gift. My name is Mark Gans, and I am currently the CEO of Cambia Health Solutions and have been so for the last 18 years. I retire in 6 weeks, and so it's a particular honor for me to be here today as your cruise director on an incredibly important topic, an incredibly important opportunity for Oregon and for us Oregonians. And I'm very grateful to the organizers of the summit that they would ask me to moderate this session. Those of you who have attended this series, as you know, in the past, we've had a single day Oregon business summit. And that occasion has been where business and policy and community leaders come together to join together and talk about what's most important for Oregon and the path forward. I've always appreciated, and our company has always supported the summit because it's really an opportunity for us to look forward. And instead of sort of cursing the darkness, there's a lot of lights that get turned on that day. And we move forward and figure out how to work together across the various divides. And that's such a thing that has made me very happy to be here in Oregon, is to see how Oregonians come together and genuinely try to work as one. And we need that in times like this, and we certainly need it this year. But because of the pandemic, instead of having a large gathering at the Oregon Convention Center as usual, we go virtual. And the summit has been broken up into various events, a series. And so I officially welcome you to the 5th event in the Oregon Business Plan Summit series. The first event set the foundation for a framework for recovery that is resilient, equitable, and takes a long-term approach. The second event highlighted trends in our economy and shed light on how the pandemic has accelerated some changes, but also highlighted festering inequities in our society. The third and fourth events focused on finding new opportunities for job creation, growth, and attraction, including preparing and creating better pathways for Oregonians to take advantage of those opportunities. Today, we are going to focus the conversation on economic mobility and systemic racism. While we know that an economic development agenda is necessary for recovery and for long-term health in the Oregon experience, we also know it is insufficient for shared prosperity. That's why this year the Oregon Business Plan has put a greater focus on strategies that improve economic mobility. We also know that without addressing systemic racism, inequities will continue to fester just under the surface and then keep boiling up to the surface in our communities. And we can do better than that here in Oregon. We all know that, and we must do better. I've had the opportunity to serve as the chair of the Oregon Oregon Opportunity Initiative, and it is a group of people that are on fire, I guess, to want to drive change, who understand that economic development and economic prosperity has to be inclusive of all, and that all have a role in helping make that happen. So over the next 90 minutes, you're going to get the opportunity to hear from 3 true experts they're not just experts, they've been warriors, both locally and nationally, in this cause to make our communities better. Our first speaker will be Michael Alexander. Our second speaker will be David Ellwood. And Senate permitting, our third speaker will be Senator Ron Wyden. We just learned that Senator Wyden may have a vote at around the time he's supposed to come on board with all of us today, and that may prevent him being able to be with us, and that will be a shame if he can't. I guess the good news is you'll all get to go on with your day earlier. But it won't be good news if we can't hear from him and interact with him, because he has been such a warrior on these issues and he cares so deeply about them. And I think is going to play a really important role in over certainly the next 4 years in helping our nation heal and focus on the right things. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael. Michael is, I had the pleasure of having the opportunity to work with Michael for several years at Cambia. But then he went on to bigger and better things as the president of the Urban League here in Portland. And beyond that, his time at the Urban League, he has just been, I guess, one of the real stalwart leaders in this community. He cares so deeply, even though he didn't grow up here in Portland. You wouldn't know it in terms of the level of care that he has for the Portland community and for the state of Oregon generally. And he's not only shown great wisdom, but also great courage in the things that he's done as a leader. And I just learned in working with him closely, he's a guy worth emulating and certainly worth listening to. So it is my pleasure to bring Michael forward to share with us his perspective on the issues of the day. Michael?
Mark, thank you very much. I appreciate those kind words, and I appreciate the opportunity to have a few moments to speak with this gathering. I want to first begin by offering an acknowledgement of the land that I have the privilege of addressing you from today. The Portland metropolitan area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Calumet, Clackamas, Band of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Moala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and to use the plentiful natural resources of the area. I want to take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. When I was asked if I would offer some comments today, it reminded me of an experience that I'm sure many others on this call, particularly people of color and specifically African Americans, have experienced over the last several months. During that time, I've had a number of colleagues, primarily white colleagues, who have reached out to me, and they've asked two questions. One, how am I doing? They were checking in on me, particularly after the tragic events following the murder of George Floyd. And then the second question was, what could they do? So to the first question, how am I doing? I'm going to share with you in very candid terms what this time has been like for me. And I have to say that responding to these outreaches at times has been exhausting. And I'm hoping that the time today will help to validate the energy that has to go into that response. But in all candor, I will say that if your intention today is to find a comfortable place to settle around these issues, then you're talking to the wrong guy. This will not be comfortable, nor should it be. The second question, what can I do? I don't have an answer, but I will offer my answer. It is not the answer by any stretch, but it is an honest assessment of what I believe are beginning efforts that need to be taken by institutions, and by leaders, so that this moment translates truly into movement. In gathering thoughts on how I'm doing, I wanted to read a essay, a sharing that I provided to the Southwest Oregon grant makers. And this was at the request of Kendall Clausen, for those of you who have worked with Kendall. She asked a number of African American leaders, men and women, to sort of share how the murder of George Floyd was impacting them. And she wanted their comments to be shared with their membership. And so I'm going to read my response, and I hope that you will bear with me because I wanted to come across exactly as it was written. It's almost impossible for me to talk about the George Floyd killing and what we are engulfed in without shutting down. I'm weary, I'm frustrated, and I'm angry at them, and equally at me, for believing that my family and my Black community's place in this nation was ever going to change. Will the day ever come when the impact of Black life from law enforcement, government, our schools, our healthcare systems will be equal to white life? Will the day ever come when I can send my sons out into the world without the warning that their color will be seen by many in law enforcement as synonymous with crime? Will my daughter be able to raise my interracial grandsons with enough guidance to explain that saying Black Lives Matter holds huge differentiation in meaning for their white grandparents than it does for their Black grandparents? Their white grandparents hope and pray for their dreams. Their Black grandparents are forced to hope and pray for their lives. These past few months have come very close to breaking me at times. I'm struggling with finding the one source of comfort that should be available in limitless quantities, and that's hope. I just don't understand how Black folks have suffered so much and seen our lives change so little. There are moments, however, when it's not lost on me that there are institutions, organizations, and allies who feel as deeply as I do. Why hasn't that shared belief been enough to move us to a better place as a nation, as a state, and even as a city? Portland, for all the qualities that it aspires to and that I hold in warm and loving regard, has a horrible history, and much of it is not relegated to the past. Say their names: Kendra James, Aaron Campbell, Keaton Otis, Juanis Hayes, Jason Washington, James Perez, Byron Hammock, and the list goes on. How can we reconcile the outrage that we should feel every day we draw breath regarding the loss of Black lives and dreams against the backdrop of the noble ambition that many white folks and Black folks aspire to? Perhaps a portion of the answer can be found in the writings of Dr. King from his imprisonment in the Birmingham jail. Dr. King wrote, quote, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." End of quote. I've spent many moments in the past few months in self-assessment on this very question, and I wish that I could say that I'm comfortable with where my responses end up. But I have carved out a starting point of sorts. That starting point is to challenge all of us to ask how many of the organizations, the nonprofits, the institutions that we lead or are associated with have committed their focus, their funding, or their programs to not being characterized as people of ill will versus working decisively and intentionally to being people of goodwill, and accepting the realization that hope and intentions don't get the job done. I've been in this work in some way, shape, or form for almost 50 years. Regrettably, the past 7 months have shown that whatever I've done in collaboration with allies has not been enough to make what my colleague Tony Hobson describes as the change versus a change. This feels a little like 1968. Despite the outrage of that time and the loud alarm demanding real change, America essentially hit the snooze button and drifted back to business as usual for Black communities and families. The undeniable truth is that over the past 7 decades of the civil rights movement, our combined and collective good enough has not been good enough. So it's time for us to seize the moment and to look at the role that we can play in making the change. It's time for people of goodwill and shallow understanding to realize that this struggle is not a spectator sport. It's time to lead the stands, follow the voice of Black leadership, and to take the field, knowing that once there, it will be an uncomfortable, stressful, and bruising time, but one that can give my grandchildren the possibility of lives that can be defined and enriched by the gifts, the rights, and the dreams their Creator has given them. Let's hope that this time in our history will be different. So that's how I was doing, and that's how I continue to experience each day. The second question was, what might my colleagues, my white colleagues, be doing? And I gathered some thoughts, and they were really evenly divided between their roles as leaders of organizations and institutions and the personal accountability that their humanity places on them as individuals. First thought in terms of an institutional response is that you cannot fix what you are unwilling to face. And we can have heated discussion, agreement and disagreement on whether this is a racist country. However, there can be no disagreement that this country has a racist history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, of separate but equal. The foundation of the laws, the policies, the codes, and the practices here in Oregon were built on legitimization of systemic racism and white supremacy, and there was no consideration given to racial justice or equity in the creation of those policies and procedures. Your organizations operate, and in many instances, they flourish within this framework. And as such, the private sector, the public sector, and government are equally complicit in maintaining the status quo and, more importantly, responsible for driving transformative change. We cannot government or nonprofit our way out of racism and the impact of white supremacy on this country and in this state. And there will be no vaccine for institutional racism. As organizations, are you prepared to institute placing racial impact statements and analysis within your strategic plan? Will you raise, support, and strengthen and measure their impact on Black and marginalized communities as a key performance measure, not an afterthought or an embedment within your plans once they've been locked and loaded? Is it core to your mission? Are you willing to invest in building trust with the African American community? Are you willing to intentionally over-index strategies for addressing historical impacts of racism and white supremacy? Communities need to believe that your policies and systems are driven by their need, and to create an opportunity for them to believe that it is not being driven by margin or greed. Are you courageous enough to be anti-racist in the formulation of your programs and policies? Will you create specific strategies that create access to resources and capital, particularly for the African American community, to not only access from you, but also to generate this on their own behalf? The civil rights movement was about being able to sit at the restaurant counter. Economic justice is more about being able to own the restaurant. And finally, when I look at organizations and institutions, I ask, are you willing to ask your African American employees how they evaluate your place within the struggle for economic and racial justice? Have you created and resourced the African American employee resource groups? And are you willing to ask them on a regular basis two questions? One, did we listen? And two, did we learn? There's lots of listening going on right now. I don't know that there's lots of learning. Asking that question will make sure that you are being held accountable by those who are best able to assess whether there's a real impact. I mentioned that I also wanted to provide some feedback to my colleagues about what they do as individuals, what they do as leaders. And again, I start with the premise that you can't fix what you don't face. I challenge you all to take time to study the history of the treatment of African Americans within the state of Oregon. It has been a unique challenge to the resiliency of this community that is different than any other place in the nation. African Americans, Black folks have faced challenges here that they never faced in Alabama and Mississippi. Take the time to understand what it has meant to be a Black Oregonian. And many of the things, many of the horrors have taken place within the course of lifetimes. For you, what may be history will be memory for many of the people who you will encounter in the African American community. I asked you to also understand that systemic racism exists at every level of society. And here are two truths. It impacts you and it benefits you, whether you seek it or not. And the second truth is, it never benefits me or other African Americans. It's a systemic challenge that we face every conscious moment. And if we don't address it, it will continue to be just that. I also ask that in this period of enlightenment and a focus on white fragility, that you don't resent the term white privilege. It doesn't mean that your life has not been hard, and it doesn't mean that you've not had to overcome challenges. It does mean, however, that the color of your skin is not one of the things that is making your life harder. And it will always be that for African Americans. We cannot learn our way, grow our way, earn our way out of that burden. It's not enough to profess that you're not racist. You must resolve to be actively and vocally anti-racist. Are you willing to have your life guided by a principle that reads, I will no longer allow racist, hurtful words, jokes, stereotype, no matter how big or small, to be uttered in my presence. I will not turn a blind eye or a deaf ear. Are you willing to position yourself so that your silence will never be viewed as complicity? And finally, I ask that you understand that Black Lives Matter is not a hateful or divisive statement. In responding that all life matters, will be offensive to many Black folks and to other marginalized communities because no one else's life has been targeted, traumatized, or stolen over centuries in the way specifically that Black lives have. And until Black lives matter, in fact, no lives matter. So those were the thoughts that resonated with me as I go through the opportunities to create true change in this city, in this state, and in this country. And I hope that they are received in the spirit to which they are intended. But this is not a comfortable time, nor should this be a comfortable discussion. And so I am very grateful to have had the opportunity to share, again, my lens, and I welcome what I hope will be the journey forward with fellow travelers, some of whom will be people of color. Hopefully all will be people of conscience. Mark, thank you very much for the introduction, and I will turn it back over to you.
Michael, I wish we could just kind of let what you just said, sink in. Beautiful words, powerful, deeply resonate. And I appreciate the fact that you care enough that you spoke straight from your heart, and you challenged us. And so we'll have time to come back for some of a bit of a fireside chat with you and our next speaker. And I look forward to following up on some questions for you. But now that we've had the benefit of your perspective, and with that lens in mind, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, David Ellwood, and he will share his perspectives on the topic. David is the Isabel and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Most recently, David chaired the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. The partnership's collective ambition is that all people achieve a reasonable standard of living with the dignity that comes from having power over their lives and being engaged in and valued, truly valued by their community. David has been a leader nationally, has served in the Clinton administration, and I think has been an advisor to several administrations because of his research and his work, which is driven by his deep caring about this issue. And so we're really honored, David, to have you with us today. We look forward to hearing your perspective. And Michael's a tough act to follow. So my condolences to you on that, but I'm sure that you will serve us well today. And so hailing from Boston, Massachusetts is David Elwood.
Thank you, Mark. To say that Michael's a tough act to follow is an understatement, indeed. But I will say that the words really do resonate in so many different ways, and I'll try and reflect back slightly occasionally on them in what I've already prepared. But I was asked to lead a group of people by the Gates Foundation. And ultimately, the question that we were asked to think about is what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? Now, in the current climate, I might ask you, what on earth are you doing thinking about this? After all, we have a pandemic of historic proportions and it's accelerating exponentially. The economy is in extraordinarily fragile state. Some parts of the economy are in disastrous places. Others have actually benefited from this period. We have had a presidential election where currently two people claim they're the next president of the United States. And under almost any scenario, it looks like we're likely to have divided government, or at least government by such a slim majority that it's hard to imagine anything happening at the federal level. And we have the sets of issues that Michael has brought forth and amplified. And and interestingly enough, in the last presidential election, 75% of voters said these issues affected their thinking deeply about the election, about equally divided between Republicans and Democrats for rather different reasons. So it's strange indeed that it's such a tough time. We think about mobility from poverty, and I guess what I would say to you is congratulations. I believe that's exactly what you should be doing. So I've got a bit of a PowerPoint here. I'm not a huge fan of PowerPoint, but I'm also not a huge fan of Zoom meetings. So we'll see what we can do here to make this work. And let me see if I can get my clicker to work. I may have to start it again. Okay. So when we were asked by the Gates Foundation to ask what it would take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty, we decided to put together a remarkably interesting and diverse group of people from around the country. And these people were from they were half scholars, half academics. I mean, half scholars, half practitioners of various sorts. They included everybody from Ai-jen Poo is the head of the U.S. Domestic Workers Alliance, to Josh Bolton, who was the head of the Business Roundtable, the group of the largest CEOs. It had John Powell, who is at Berkeley Law School, focuses a lot on the sorts of issues that we were hearing from Michael, and many others in between. And the question really is, could we ask this really big question? And part of the way we did it was we did site visits across the country, dozens of them. The group as a whole did 4. And it was a really striking experience. And by the way, if you'd like to, some of those kinds of issues that come to light that Michael was talking about, you can see them in every place that we visited, whether it was New York or the Mississippi Delta in spades, but even in Silicon Valley and certainly in Detroit and beyond. But as a result of that, we did spend some time and come to a remarkable degree of agreement when the group wasn't actually expected to come to necessarily any agreement, just to find out what we thought. And so we've heard already, one of the first things we had to do was decide what we meant by mobility. And by the way, I'm going to talk about it as mobility, not economic mobility, even though that's in your title, precisely because we quickly figured out that, and I'm an economist, so we quickly figured out that economic success was a big part of what we meant by mobility, upward mobility, but that was way too limiting. And that when you spent time in site visits, looking at people around the country and folks that are struggling to get by, you immediately realize that an equally strong desire was the desire to have real power and autonomy over their lives, a real sense of control. And also, and this was one of the things that was, interestingly enough, that conservatives and liberals, or the right and left, deeply agreed on, is that everyone would like to be valued in and admired in the community. And so it was all 3 of those things that we meant by mobility. And as an economist, I will say I have tended to, I believe in the past, and I've worked in Washington, I've worked as a dean of the School of Public Policy and other things, that perhaps I focused too much on economic success and didn't think enough about some of these other issues. We also managed to, after a lot of energy and thinking and these visits and reading and so on, we ultimately focused on 5 things. And one of the things I should say is we, by design, chose not to do deep dives into education or healthcare. Sorry, Mark. That in fact, those are things that many people have been spending enormous time in and we weren't quite sure what additional value add we could offer. We believe those are central to what we do, and they are embedded in much of what we talked about. But we looked at 5 other issues, and the interesting thing we concluded on, ultimately these 5 things that we concluded, was that all 5 were absolutely essential if you were going to make genuine progress, serious, significant progress in increasing upward mobility. And the 5 were: first, you've got to change the narrative. Some of this is what you've been hearing from Michael, but I'll say a little bit more on other things. The narrative of what's our story about poverty or the lack of mobility and the like. Second, we've got to make sure that everyone has access to good jobs, and we'll talk more about what we meant by that. Third, we've got to ensure that zip code is not destiny, and of course, by its very presence here, we find it is very much so, and many of you know about that. Fourth, when one does provide support, one has to do it in such a way that the people that are getting that support feel empowered and advanced by it, rather than often humiliated or isolated by it. And finally, we need to learn what the business has known for a long time, that data has the possibility of transforming both our ability to hold ourselves and other people accountable, but also to recognize when we fail and what's wrong with it. So I'm just going to focus briefly on each of the first three, but we can talk more about the others at Q&A or some other occasion. There is a report and some other things you can look at if you are interested. So I want to talk about changing the narrative. And there's no way I can be articulate, and indeed some of what I say may feel like it's slightly at odds of what Michael said, and I would argue it's not at all. But what I will say is the ways in which we often talk about how we explain why people are mired in poverty, or why there are situations where families or individuals do not escape it, we often have some dangerous narratives, I would say, and they represent often the cleavages in America. One of those narratives is we say, well, what's wrong with those people? Why can't they pull themselves up by the bootstraps the way the rest of us do? And the other narrative, which can be equally problematic, is say, oh, they're just victims of the system. They're just victims and the first one is obvious because it totally ignores the reality of systemic racism and all the others. But the second is problematic because it takes away all agency. It doesn't make them human beings. It's just those victims. It's them. And indeed, I would say ultimately what we focused on most heavily, and indeed where right and left could really deeply agree, that most distressing to us about where we are as we try and think about solutions was the fact that the real danger is othering. Grandmothers used to vote for raising school finances, raising taxes or whatever in their local community, because even if their own biological children weren't being schooled, their children were nonetheless, our children were being schooled there. Now they vote against it because it's their children, it's them, it's the others, it's the people that aren't like us or shouldn't be trusted or whatever else. Now, when you say the danger is othering, and certainly the last 4 years has been an extreme case of othering immigrants and people of color, women, all kinds of settings. People say, yeah, but wait, there are very different experiences between people of different backgrounds and races and so forth. So are you just saying we're all the same? And basically, the group was very, very clear. The opposite of othering isn't saming, it's belonging. That we all are human beings, we all belong together, and we have our different struggles, and but we need to recognize the lived experience of each other as people that are us. And by the way, just to speak as a classic, I guess you would call me Eastern liberal, even though I grew up in Minnesota and love Oregon. Boy, Oregon is gorgeous. I used to constantly use the language of the poor. Now, if I talk about the women, or I talk about the Latinos, or I talk about the gays, that is immediately it sounds, oh, that's ridiculous. And yet we're comfortable talking about the poor. To be fair, we sometimes talk about the rich. But it really says it's them. And if we instead talk about struggling families or people that are working hard but not able to make it or whatever else, that's beginning to talk about people that are like us, that are our friends, our brothers, our sisters, our peers. And that is the nature of belonging. And changing the narrative means getting to a place where we think of ourselves as collectively seeking to succeed, and that those people who are not succeeding are people that we need to find ways to change the systems and provide the kinds of help and opportunities to move forward. Next, and I don't want to take too long here, create access to good jobs. Now, this is so commonly said that it sounds like absolute pablum, but it's actually a really, really important part of thinking about where we are. And I'm a labor economist, but what's a good job? Well, of course, a good job it starts with having good pay. It has good benefits, but what also is true, and you see this especially when you travel around the country and talk to various low-wage workers or employers and so forth. A good job has something else. It has dignity and respect. It has people respect you. They treat you with dignity. You are not invisible. Worse yet, you are not despised. And that's absolutely vital. And finally, the last thing is a good job is one that actually can be a springboard to the next opportunity. It is a rung along a ladder. It is a chance that it is a job that leads somewhere. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about essential workers right now and how important they are and how grateful we are to the essential workers. Some of these are healthcare workers, but often the essential workers are the people who bring us the groceries or at least stock our shelves, who take care of our parents or our children, that do all kinds of other things to make our life livable. We have another name for the jobs that those people have. They're called bad jobs. They typically pay poorly. They often lack benefits. Even in the healthcare field, they often lack benefits. People in those jobs at best are invisible, and frankly, we expect ideal service, or we're just enormously unhappy, and they lead nowhere. If you ask yourself, whoever most recently delivered you some food or bagged some groceries or whatever else for you, ask or took care even of your mother or your children, ask what their opportunities are for the next level and what's going on. And I would really argue that we're in a situation right now where, quite honestly, the low to moderate wage market is simply failing. I'm an economist. This is a classic example of market failure. And I think the biggest source of market failure, interestingly enough, is bad information. If you go to hire someone in a low to moderate wage job, you don't collect much information. You don't have very much information about the person and their previous experience. And if the person themselves is looking to get a new job, they have very little information about the employer or where it all leads or whatever. Think about, for example, in a place, large employer, for example, someplace like a Walmart or whatever. Many of these places have rules that say if you don't show up for 3 days, regardless of the reason, we'll just let you go because we just can't run our business that way. But people cannot show up for a lot of reasons, like, for example, their brother could have borrowed the car and left it, failed to tell you that there was no gas left, and so you ran out of gas, and you have just no way to solve that problem within a day or two because you don't have any additional money. Well, that could have been a terrific worker, but no one's going to call Walmart to see how good the worker was when they left, and so on. Same thing, if you knew someone that said, gee, I'm just not ready for college right now, what kind of job should I try and start with that would really maybe lead somewhere? There's actually no good way to answer that question. Each of us would probably give an idiosyncratic answer like, oh, do what I did or don't do what I did. That's just a classic example. And because of this, the incentives are all wrong. The incentives are wrong for employers. The incentives are wrong for workers. And so that's why workers can't find good jobs and employers can't find good workers, because the market is failing to do what it does for almost everyone on this call every day. If I was looking for a job, it'd be easy to find out what, my strengths and weaknesses, and that's true of almost everybody. And if someone was thinking about hiring me, I would have an easy way to do it. Not so in a huge part of the labor market. Next, there's weak training. I know you focused on training in previous sessions. I'm not going to talk about it, but there's weak training because partly it's often just generic, but also if people aren't going to stay very long, no one wants to invest in training. There's very little portability of benefits, even when there are benefits. If you leave, you lose whatever benefits you have. Not easy to move them from place to place. There are some attempts, but again, and probably most importantly is this lack of obvious job ladders. Really, if a job leads nowhere, what's the point in working hard at it to try and get to be successful? And if you don't see how that works, that's a huge problem, again, for both employers and employees. Employers would like terrific employees that learn and grow and stick with them. That would allow them to pay them better and so on. And employees would like the same thing, and yet it isn't happening. What I would like to just argue is, I know that a number of things that appear in the Oregon business strategy are talking about sectoral solutions, different sectors of the economy linking together to talk about and come to solutions that can really matter. And finding people on both sides of that, whether it's worker groups, unions, other kinds of things, but also the various employers, so that there is a way to create information trains and create job ladders, portability, and other kinds of things. That's a way where we can make those bad jobs into good jobs, that as they should be, because we call them essential. And I would argue that you guys are in an extraordinarily good position in Oregon, partly just because of the nature of the climate there and so on, but also because of groups like this. That Oregon really could be a model of how we could try and make the next generation of work for people, because right now it doesn't. Okay, quickly, ensure zip code is not destiny. I suspect many of you have seen the slides put together by Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Institute. Here is an example of one of those. This is actually based on census tracts, I believe. And what the Chetty, using very extraordinary data from the IRS, basically everybody's tax records for many, many, many years, could do is say, let's look at people who had income, families where the income was quite low, let's say at the 25th percentile, the bottom quarter of the income distribution, who lived in each of these neighborhoods, and what happened to their children. And what this chart shows you is how much income on average their children had when they became adults in their families. And what you can see is, in some places, this is hard to read, but like in Boise or Humboldt or Sabin, often families had like $16,000 if they came from poor families in that neighborhood. In other areas, if they may have had people who came from poor families, but in a different neighborhood, like Laurelhurst, can be in the 50s or 60s. This is by the way, the neighborhood where you grew up, not where you ended up. This is where you grew up. These enormous differences, and I can go over the specifics of this. They work very hard by comparing siblings who moved at different ages and so forth. This is pretty darn close to causal. So that really does mean where you grow up. Zip code is destiny. So what on earth can you do about that? Well, first of all, variation in outcomes this great just by neighborhood is just a travesty. It's an outrage. It just violates every principle of fairness that we can think of. And of course, the sets of issues that Michael talks about, we've worked very hard to segregate people of color and others into precisely those neighborhoods, and indeed to make sure they're not very effective in creating mobility. But there is some good news there as well. The fact is that there are good neighborhoods and that there are also bad neighborhoods. Gives you a place to start looking. You know, I personally would urge you to look locally, look at these maps, go to those places to learn what distinguishes high and improving opportunity neighborhoods. What makes for a high opportunity neighborhood, and especially neighborhoods that seem like they're improving. You can get some of that from Raj Chetty, where the neighborhood used to be low opportunity, now it looks like becoming higher opportunity. What's really doing that? You know, you can bring in all your experts and other kinds of things, but this is Oregon, and Portland, and you can actually just go and look and understand and do that kind of site visit and try and understand, is this an issue where policing is a huge issue? How about transportation? How about economic opportunities? How about financial resources and so forth, banking? There's just so much you can learn by focusing on this. So I would love to talk about the other two and so on, but I guess my basic message to you is, I think you all have made, this is a moment where people's eyes have been opened and they're starting to see a variety of things, but where people are hungry for change, hungry for something else, because people are afraid. One of the great tragedies of this pandemic period was we used it to widen our differences rather than bring us together and remember that we have some common identities in the human race. And so I guess I would end with a quote often attributed to Winston Churchill, though there's no direct evidence that he actually said it. If he did, is maybe in a summit with his counterparts from Russia and the United States. But it's often said, and you hear it often. But I would just urge you to never let a good crisis go to waste. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. And I love that quote because it's a good one. And this has been a very tough year, and there has been a lot of divisiveness. But I think things that are really hard take time to gestate. And if in fact that out of this hard time comes a sense of urgency and that's born out of a sense of hope, which then causes people to act with greater courage and commitment, then I think the story isn't over yet. And I believe maybe someday, hopefully, our children or grandchildren will look back at this time and with more positive memories because of what happened and how we improved over time. That's certainly my hope, and I believe that, frankly, it will. Because I think that Winston Churchill also said that we tend to exhaust every other possibility before we finally get it right. And I think that it's time to get it right, because not only I think exhausted many false starts, but we are exhausting ourselves, as Michael, you put it earlier. So let me ask you a couple of questions. David, your presentation focused on changing the narrative around poverty reduction. I'm curious, and I'd actually ask both of you, but David, if you would start, is what 1, 2, or 3 things you would coach the business community in this state to lean into, to action? What are the center pins, to use a bowling analogy, where if we hit a center pin, 9 other pins will fall in the right direction? And just what might that be? And then secondly, are there businesses, companies around the country that you've encountered that seem to be better at hitting center pins? And what have they done that could be instructive to those of us here in this state, so we really move? And Michael, I'd ask you to think about the same question.
So let me start by saying I'm an economist. Have you ever thought about asking an economist how to change the narrative? I mean, really, this is just, I'm the wrong person to ask, and I really believe that. So my starting point would actually say, I took notes heavily while Michael was speaking. I thought a number of, Michael, your comments were spectacular in this regard, including the accountability issue, and the like. I will say this, though. Business actually does want create a sense of community and belonging within their business, typically. Now, you can argue they differ, sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. But I think that what they're less good at is then trying to create a sense of community broadly with their community and further out. And one of the things I would just say is that systematically we have gone to a fair amount of effort to actually reduce. Used to be things like unions or various other ways that people could really have real voice within their companies and within their communities. That's what it means to say that we are in this together, that we really do listen. We do really want to hear what you have to say. And Michael, I was struck by your two questions that everybody should be able to answer about accountability and whether you're on the right side of the struggle. So that would be my starting point. And I would just also say, I don't have the perfect business to point out to you, though there are people on this, on the group. John Powell, for example, who's this African-American lawyer at the Haas Institute in Berkeley, spectacular guy, does this for a living to try and help people think about some of those kinds of questions. I will say this, whether I don't know how real it is or not, we had a reunion recently of this group of partners, and Josh Bolton was there again as the head of the Business Roundtable. And he basically said, I've never seen my CEOs more interested in actually listening to how to think about this problem right now. Now, whether that lasted more than 15 minutes, I do not know. But that was an opening. So now that's as much as I have to say. And now let's talk to someone who actually knows something about this, and that's Michael.
Yeah. And Michael, I want to acknowledge your comment about, did we listen, and more importantly, did we learn? My experience just in recent months has been, I've never seen the level of conversation among CEOs, at least in the healthcare business that I've been a part of, where there has been an absolute sense of earnestness and earnest desire to move forward. I also sense a bit of wanting to understand how to do that. And maybe the learning is by the doing. But any thoughts about that in terms of what are the things that you think that businesses can do, starting maybe internally within the way that they operate? You had a couple of ideas, but also externally.
Big question, Mark, and I will probably circle around some thinking associated with it. I do think that it is an area where it's easier to indicate commitment than it is to specify the path forward in achieving it. But I think a couple of things can happen. One is to understand that as a business, and particularly businesses in Oregon, I would say to a CEO or a CFO or a board, allow yourself to project forward 25 years. Look at what the composition of the populace, the workforce, will be in this state. 50% of the children in Portland public schools are from communities of color. Look at the business model adaptations that you will need to make in order to sustain yourself in your current line of business, the demographic changes, the shifts in housing. Can you envision what it's going to require in terms of where you are versus where you need to be? And then immerse yourself in that work. And in some ways, the work will teach you. There are very few new facts. I think the last 7 or 8 months have forced us to look at what has been in front of us in many ways for decades. But there are very few new facts. What we have to have are new strategies to address those, and to understand that a part of that is allowing yourself to visualize what does success look like. I think in corporations, when strategic plans are created, they're created towards reading the path forward to reaching certain discernible outcomes. There isn't a plan to nowhere. There's a plan to an outcome. There's a plan to a metric. And I think we have to approach this in the same way. And again, part of that cannot happen without it being intentionally stated as such. I think the other challenge, and I have the opportunity to sit with a tremendous group of people across the state on the Economic Justice Council. And as we look to what we know, one of the challenges is that we're not measuring the data that's going to tell us how we're doing, where we're going, and whether or not this is a successful strategy. We hear that we have locked and loaded into ways in which we gather information or operate bureaus. And in many instances, it will not unpack it so that we understand the greater and lesser of impacts in terms of the charge that we have, who it's impacting, who it's not impacting, and where we need to strategically pivot what we do and how we do it. A part of that has got to be stepping back and saying we can't retrofit a system that was not designed to serve the needs that we're identifying today. We've got to reconstruct. There's no way to retrofit into some of those data streams and collection and bureau policies. We've got to be prepared to burn some boats. It's not what we do. In some instances, it's what we're no longer going to do. And I think letting go of that is very difficult for large, complex organizations.
Well,
there's a difference between talking to a psychologist and an actuary. I mean, they're wired different.
Yeah. I was going to say that I think companies like programs because they're orderly and you can kind of put it together and you kind of execute the program. And I don't know if you agree with me on this, but my learning, one of my learnings, many learnings, I guess, through many years of making mistakes and learning from mistakes and trying to learn and get better is that, and I've talked with a number of employees of colors who from our company and other companies saying, yeah, the company has great programs, but I'm not really feeling the love. And it's sort of like the companies they get a program going and then it's sort of dished off and it's like, go for it, but this, I don't feel like this can be solved with a program or a set of programs. It is more about a conversion of the heart. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for leaders, because there's a lot of business leaders and about how to lead differently so that we get past the quote, come up with another program and call it good.
Mark, I do. I mean, my thought is to always understand what problem you're trying to solve. And not a suite of problems, but what is the primary problem you're trying to solve? And are you willing to lead with that? Not to have it included as part of a portfolio of impacts, not to have it be a downstream lever. I mean, but what problem are you trying to solve? And are people in the room for the same reason? And it's always a challenge when you begin to say, how many people can I bring to this? If a part of that, if the collateral damage from that is a lack of specificity and focus as to why you're in the room. That comment about being anti-racist is very powerful for me. It's not enough to simply not be racist. It's where do you line up on a field that has two polarities? You're supporting or you're opposing. And you're doing it in a very dramatic and intentional way, understanding that for many people of color, once they leave the building, once they leave the workforce, once they leave their place of employment, they go back into lives where the impacts of racism and white supremacy are as ubiquitous as the air they breathe. It's got to be who lines up with you around that issue so that it's clear that silence is not to be misinterpreted as a lack of prioritization.
Okay.
Let me just add a small point, which is just I think it's just very hard to identify with this unless you actually get out. You talked, Michael, about what lives look like. I cannot tell you how. We were with a bunch of incredible experts, and we did these site visits across the country. We visited people's. We did programs. We took Bill Gates in the middle of a prison and had him. He met with inmates. We, a whole bunch of Bill and Melinda, and you just can't. And that doesn't pretend that after a few visits they're just but you can at least recognize that you don't know, and that you need to listen. And so I don't know whether that's doable or how you think about it, but I would just say in this roundtable, nobody missed a site visit because they were so intense. And these are people that spent their lives thinking, seemingly being the experts on the very thing that we were visiting.
Yeah. So because Senator Wyden, I think we are going to be fortunate to have him here. He may actually, I don't know if he's on yet, but I'm going to ask you a question, David, about, when you worked for the Clinton administration and you worked on supporting social safety net reform, I'm curious if what you're most hopeful about in terms of the biggest opportunity that the new administration will have to make additional reforms to an outdated and inequitable system. Do you have, what advice would you be giving to President-elect Biden at this point?
Those are two different questions.
I know they are.
But first of all, I think this is going to be a time of healing. I think this needs to be a time of healing, of coming together. It's unlikely to be a moment where some of the radical things that I would like to see happen and so forth are even going to be on the table. Maybe I'm wrong. So that's on the advice phase and so forth. I will say I think healthcare remains an area that has real promise. And frankly, if we could get healthcare taken care of so that people didn't have to worry about that anymore and everybody had healthcare in a reasonable way and so forth, I think it would be a huge step forward for both business and certainly for the workers. That said, I guess I will mention briefly, as someone who spent their life on it, one popular, simple idea right now that I am not a very big fan of is a universal basic income. And it seems great, give everybody $1,000 a month for life. Of course, the price tag of that is $4 trillion every year. So you got to raise taxes to do that, and most likely you cut out a bunch of other things. But it's partly saying it's not just money. It is also about dignity. It's about respect. It's about opportunities. It's about job ladders. And you give me a third of that money, and I think you could really do some remarkable things to make work pay, to think about the strategies that really do go a long way towards turning the so-called bad jobs into good jobs that they should be. And so for me, my focus, the safety net has all kinds of embedded craziness in it. Cliffs, you earn an extra dollar, you lose your health care. And that craziness, by the way, is not just experienced by those trying to do it. It's the people that never get on the programs. A lot of people who dislike Obamacare dislike it not because they weren't better off because of it, but they resent the fact that they're working hard and they're having to pay for something that someone who they see as not working is getting it for free. And so you've got to think through how you make it seem like it's fair, adjustable, and affordable and just for everyone. So I would just say, that's it. So.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that very much. Michael and David, it's been wonderful having you with us. So much appreciate the work that you do every day and the substantive work that you do to make our community and make our nation better. I appreciate, I think on behalf of everyone who's been here, let me just express appreciation for being so direct today and speaking from your heart to us. And you give us a gift by being with us today, and I want to thank you for that. I understand that Senator Ron Wyden is in fact now joining us, and so we will wrap this portion up and move to Senator Wyden.
Mark, thank you. And I'm sorry that I was on the floor when Michael was talking, but I heard he was just incredibly powerful and perceptive about the challenges ahead. So I want him to know that I'm going to be following up on his important remarks. And let me start by saying I'm going to be brief, because the only thing that is worse than a filibuster in Congress is a filibuster over Zoom. So I'm not going to inflict that on anybody. And I really appreciate OBP putting so much focus on racial equity. That's something I'm working on the Finance Committee. And there is no question that Black and Hispanic members of our community have suffered disproportionately from the coronavirus, and the jobs crash has hit them disproportionately hard. And we know that we're looking at this pause in our state, and I think it is hard to see anything other than another significant set of economic challenges, because when you don't have that economic activity, particularly during the holiday season, it really takes a big toll. So what I thought we ought to be doing is looking at equity issues and support issues around some ideas and approaches that I think really have a chance to make a big difference. And not all of you may know about our experience with unemployment insurance. What we did in the spring, in my view, was one of the most important things I've been involved in my time in public service, because the unemployment system in the spring of 2020, when the pandemic hit, was basically almost 100 years old. Didn't think that we'd have gig workers or self-employed or independent contractors or people like that. And we basically had to redo it completely. And in Oregon, it was far from perfect, because we know our employment department had a lot of technology problems and the like, but still hundreds of thousands of Oregonians were able to get some help and be in a position to be able to make rent and pay for groceries and pay for essentials. And yes, we've had a lot of challenges with respect to the employment department. We're still working now to get them, for example, to make sure that that backlog of claims is taken care of by the end of the year. But it's a tool that really responds to the call for racial and economic justice that I think OBP is appropriately talking about. And people said, well, did it discourage people from working? There's no evidence of that. If the unemployment law that I wrote in the spring of 2020 was something that would discourage people from working, when it lapsed in July 31st, we would have had all those people, basically, according to this theory that people don't really want to work, they would all be sprinting back to the workforce. But unemployment was still very high in August and September. So I think we look at models that work, number one, and try to lay out some principles that are going to guide us. And one that I hope government and business will look at is creating an escalator that helps people get up and out of poverty. Because we're not just going to get this done patching a hole in the safety net over here and patching a hole over there. I mean, it is just long past time for Congress to get serious about affordable child care, because COVID has made the situation worse. We've got kids at home. A lot of child care providers have closed. Working families deserve a major investment in the infrastructure of child care, and I've introduced actually legislation to do that. Housing is another major challenge that needs a fresh approach. And I've staked out ground that said the first thing we ought to do is get a safe shelter over every homeless child in our state and in our country. And I picked up on this because I was struck as we went through the spring that I was getting these reports about how kids were sleeping in the woods and they were getting picked up by school buses and other buses from the community and being taken to school. Now, how is it that in a country as rich and strong as ours, we're willing to say that's acceptable for a kid to sleep out in the cold Oregon woods in the winter, in the rain, try and learn, undoubtedly having little, to eat. And you just think about what that does in terms of taking a toll on their future and on their lives. So housing, childcare, a focus on rural areas. I just had a virtual town hall that was conducted for a number of rural Oregon counties at the East Oregonian in Pendleton. We talked about some of the ways to better serve folks. They've been in the vanguard, for example, in terms of telehealth. They've been in the vanguard of some areas that can help produce new jobs. Pendleton, for example, is going to be one of the ringleaders in the West in terms of UAVs. And these unmanned aerial vehicles can be huge in terms of mountaintop rescue and firefighting and precision agriculture. And if anybody's having trouble sleeping, I actually wrote an essay on it for the East Oregonian last Sunday. So there's a lot to do. I gather from everybody that Michael really gave us a kind of battle plan to follow. And I want to just add one last point because it was something I was talking about with senators from the West, is I've also proposed a 21st century civilian conservation corps that could create thousands of good paying jobs for young people in the outdoor economy that, of course, we treasure in Oregon. And that's a twofer. We could put to work many young people from communities of color, and we could prevent some of these devastating infernos that we're seeing in our woods. These are not your grandfather's fires. These are bigger, more powerful. And why don't we take steps now with something like a civilian conservation corps to put young people to work and to have a brighter future? So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Softballs are encouraged since I began the day at some ridiculous hour, dark, 5 a.m. or something like that. But let's see if there are questions, Mark, from the OBP flock.
I do have a couple of questions. Appreciate the opportunity to do that. And the one thing I would ask you, Senator, if you can turn your volume down on your speaker slightly so that it doesn't rebound. But I guess I want to start with this.
Is that better?
I want to just tell you that I love your idea about the civilian.
Mark, is that better?
Yes, 100%.
Good.
Thank you. I'm being told by our host too that we're good. I love your idea about the Civilian Conservation Corps. I remember growing up in Spokane and going up, and seeing the buses that said Civilian Conservation Corps on, and I always thought as a kid, wouldn't that be fun to do sometime? But I'd like to ask you, just as a kickoff, what can the business community do to combat racism, since it leads to a kind of a chronic lack of opportunity for too many people in our state? Do you have any ideas you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think our business community needs to get out into communities of color and make a specific effort to try to attract some of those young people into programs that will train them create educational opportunity for them, and create this, as I call it, escalator out of poverty and hopelessness. And the fact is that there's an opportunity to try a lot harder. And for example, I think we all know about job notices and putting stuff up online and the like. And so often it feels like somebody in government is asking about something and people get frustrated by the bureaucracy and they just check the box. But if, for example, a black employee gets out into the black community and talks about some of the ways in which they were able to get ahead and comes back to the office and says, I found the following young people who are particularly promising, and I think we ought to make an investment that's good for the company and good for this young person. Give them a chance to get ahead. That's the kind of thing I think that makes sense. That's part of my escalator out of poverty. I used to call it the Elevate Act, but I really want now an escalator because I want people to be able to go from the ground level to positions of prominence.
I love that. De La Salle High School in North Portland is an example of that in terms of the apprenticeships that they create. Our company participates in many Portland companies. One of my thoughts around that is that we just need to do more of that. We need to escalate our efforts because it's been a great experience working with the young men and women that have come to work at our company, and they've given. I think we've gained as much as they've gained by having them as a part of our family. Let me ask another question with regard to the pandemic and the already existing disparities for small businesses owned by women and people of color. What would be a message of hope that you could give us related to what Congress can do for them in the economic hardship that they're facing in this pandemic? And just what are your thoughts about the next stimulus package and what it might be able to do to address some of these issues?
We have introduced several pieces of legislation that really come from the community. I've got a staffer in the Portland office, Tim Leahy, whose job expressly is to reach out to entrepreneurs in communities of color. We've, for example, led the effort in terms of the PPP program. That's the money, it's the program that makes funds available to the underbanked. And we said, you've got to do more in terms of communities of color, expanding the EIDL program, the economic injury program. I will tell you, one of my favorites is a bill that I proposed because when I first started talking about it, readers at USA Today liked it a lot, and it really came to be something that we thought would send a positive message, and that is the first hire tax credit, so that we could say to those small businesses in the community, African American businesses, Hispanic businesses, ones where people have put in an enormous amount of sweat equity and are just trying to send a message that they can grow. The first person tax credit is one really targeted way in which to do it, the first hire tax credit, and something that I'll push very hard for on the Finance Committee.
Yeah. You're going to be, you have been, and you will no doubt be a very important, critically important leader in the Senate, in the coming Senate, regardless of which way the Georgia goes. When you think about the next 4 years and working with President-elect Biden, what are you most hopeful for in terms of, or most on fire about in terms of what you really want to get done over the next 4 years in the area of racial inequity?
I very much appreciate the fact that Joe Biden came out of the gate and said, whether you voted for me or whether you voted against me, I'm going to be the president of everybody. We're going to have to find a way to bring people together. So I've got a number of priorities, particularly, won't surprise you, Mark, in healthcare. Our committee has jurisdiction over Medicaid. I think we ought to be looking at ways to strengthen that. I think that we ought to be looking at ways to hold down the cost of medicine. There is a disproportionate effect on the cost of healthcare, again, in communities of color. Minorities have much bigger out-of-pocket costs than do affluent whites. And on pharmaceuticals, for example, we ought to lift the restriction on Medicare so that Medicare could bargain to hold down the costs. I just mentioned housing and mentioned affordable child care. I hope that the first major Biden bill will be an infrastructure bill on roads, bridges, transportation systems, and there'll be an aggressive effort to hire from communities of color. We tried to do that with my Build America Bonds program in 2009. I think that now we have an opportunity to pick up additional support. So infrastructure, healthcare, the question of housing, affordable childcare, and all brought together around a proposition that we want a policy here in this country that gives everybody a chance to get ahead. That, to me, is the most important thing, because for too long, there's been look at the tax code. We got two tax codes in America. We got one for a black nurse. Her taxes are compulsory. They come out of every paycheck. No Cayman Island breaks for her. And then we got another tax system for hedge fund operators and people who make their money on investments. And very often, they can pay what they want, when they want to, and often nothing at all. So I think on taxes, on healthcare, on housing, on childcare, and with leadership coming from the White House and bipartisan support in the Congress, we can make a big difference in terms of creating opportunity and a path for Oregonians and people in our country to ride that escalator to a better future. And when I've had a chance to look at Michael's speech, I'll have more to say.
Very well. Senator, we are so fortunate to have you as one of our senators in the Senate, and we know how fortunate the country is to have you serving in the Senate, and we look forward to a very busy next 4 years of work.
Well, thank you. My wife always says my husband is infamous rather than famous. Thank you.
Fair enough. Well, infamous or famous, we are very, very pleased to have you representing all of us. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for being with us and doing the great work that you do for this state.
Thanks to OBP for putting this special focus on racial injustice and what we're going to do to turn it around. Look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, folks, we are almost at time, and I have a couple of things that I'd like to do. I'm not going to try to end with eloquent words, because I think that we have heard eloquent words today, and it's best that we all just let that sink in. That's certainly how I'm feeling right now. What I do want to do is thank all of you for taking time out of your day to be here. I want to thank the leaders that were with us, the three incredible people that joined us today. Thank you for how much you care, and thank you for taking the time today to be with us and to share your perspective. I also know that events like this are not possible without the kind of sponsors that enabled this to be free of charge so that all of us could be here. And so I want to specifically ask that you join me in thanking, and I'm going to read the list here, the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, the Bank of America, the Pape Group, the Tillamook County Creamery Association, ADEC, Dusky Goose, the winery, Oregon Business and Industry, Pacific Power, Portland General Electric, Springboard Group, Dutch Brothers, or as my kids say, Dutch Bros, Hoffman Construction Company, Kaiser Permanente, Northwest Natural, Ochoco Lumber Company in Central Oregon, Portland Trailblazers, the Lemelson Foundation, and U.S. Bank. I want to thank all of you for leaning in so that we could have such a powerful conversation as we had today, and that all of you could be here without being charged so to be. So I hope it was a valuable use of time, and we are right at 3 o'clock, and so I will bid you a good day, and thank you.